Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be reading from Christian Heroes Then and Now series Florence Young, Chapter 4 Changes. Over the next day or so, Florence caught up on all the family news. Constance was away at the boarding school in Dunedin, and Emily had given birth to two more children while Florence was away in England. Florence was delighted to learn that Emily and the four children would be visiting in February. However, when they arrived, the news was not good. Florence's brother-in-law, John, had been kicked in the knee by a horse the previous winter, and the joint had not healed. In fact, it had become so painful that Dr. John had given up his busy medical practice because he needed bed rest. The young family rallied around to help, and it was decided that Florence should join Arthur and Horace at Ermydale, and that the 6 members of the Deck clan should join them there for the fall and winter. The Ermydale house was larger than the one her parents lived in Ottapiri and was better suited to a large influx of visitors. Florence loved Ermydale and did not mind going there to help out. She enjoyed getting to know her new niece, Emily, or Emmy, as everyone called her, and her nephew, Harry. Fall and winter passed quickly, but as spring rolled around, John was no better. A family meeting was held, and it was decided that John should return to England for an operation. Emily would go with him and take the two oldest children, Kathleen and Constance, with her. The two youngest children would stay with Florence. In September, Florence accompanied her sister to Dunedin, where the Deck family now lived, to help with the depressing task of disposing or of packaging up the family's furniture and belongings. On her first Saturday in Dunedin, Florence went to the local Plymouth Brethren prayer meeting with her sister. From the moment she stepped into the hall, Florence felt like she had when Mr. Honore had visited the family at Ermydale. Her stomach turned to knots, and as she listened to a brethren elder preach, she began convinced that tonight was the night she must become a Christian. When the meeting was over, Emily introduced herself to the speaker, Albert Brunton. "Would you like to break bread with us tomorrow?" Mr. Brunton asked. Florence did not know what to say. She had heard that a person should publicly acknowledge that Christ was his or her Savior before being baptized and before taking communion, something Florence had never done. "But," she stammered, "how could I? Aren't I supposed to be baptized first?" Mr. Brunton smiled. "You do love the Lord, don't you?" he asked. As she thought about this question, a surge of confidence flowed through Florence. "Yes, I do," she replied. "Then wouldn't you like to meet with us at his table?" "Yes, I would, if I may," said Florence. The following morning, Florence went to the morning service with Emily and took communion. She felt a new freedom like she had never experienced before. A week later, Mr. Brunton baptized Florence. Florence's 18th birthday soon rolled around, and her father arrived with a beautifully bound copy of Bagster's Bible for a birthday gift. Florence knew she would treasure it for the rest of her life. It took 6 weeks to pack up the Deck home. When the job was done, Florence knew it was time to head home again. Spring had settled over the countryside, and lambing season was in full swing. At the end of October, Florence boarded for the 300-ton steamer Wanganui for the trip to Bluff. The steamer left on Wednesday morning and would arrive in Bluff at daybreak the next morning, which, if everything went according to schedule, which it did not. The trip started out normally enough. The Wanganui was filled with more than 100 passengers, including many poor Scottish people hoping to make a living off the rugged New Zealand landscape. Florence had bought herself a berth in the ladies' cabin, which she shared with 7 other women and a stewardess. Those passengers who did not have berths slept on the benches and tables in the saloon. As it turned out, no one slept at all that night. A furious gale blew up as the ship headed south. The Wanganui pitched and rolled in the churning sea, making most on board sick. When the vessel rounded Cape Saunders, the gale became so fierce that the ship was forced to seek shelter behind a reef lest it be swamped by the roiling waves. It took 2 anchors to hold the ship in place against the onslaught. The time of their arrival on Bluff came and went, and they were still stuck in the storm. After another day and night, the ship was still huddled behind the reef. By now, all the food supplies on board had been used up, and the captain was worried. He had used up so much coal fighting against the storm that he did not have enough fuel to return to Dunedin and wait out the storm in the confines of the harbor there. All he could do was stay at anchor behind the reef and hope and pray that the storm would abate soon. The next day, one of the anchor chains holding the Wanganui snapped, and the vessel began to drift precariously close to the rocky reef. The captain did his best to keep the ship afloat and off the rocks, but the storm still howled. Finally, the following day, the winds began to abate, and the Wanganui was able to resume its journey to Bluff. But the going was still slow, and they did not reach Bluff until Sunday morning. The voyage had turned into a 4-day nightmare, and Florence was very relieved to once again have her feet on dry land. Arthur was waiting with a covered wagon to meet his sister in Bluff. He explained to Florence that the weather was now so beautiful that he had decided they should make a camping expedition of their journey back to Ermaydale. Florence was delighted, and they set out along the coast. They set out at a leisurely pace, and it took them 3 days to get to Ermaydale. While Florence had been in Dunedin helping Emily pack, her parents had been Emily's two younger children had moved back into the house at Ermaydale, and Horace, Ernest, and Constance, who had returned from boarding school, had moved into the house at Utapiri. Mrs. Young was pleased to see her daughter again. She had been looking after her husband, who was ill with flu. Within a couple of weeks of Florence's return, Mr. Young started feeling better. No sooner had Mr. Young recovered than there was an urgent message arrived from Utapiri. Horace was dangerously ill with pneumonia and wanted his mother and Florence to come at once to look after him. Mr. Young agreed to look after Emily's two younger children, and the woman left that evening. Arthur drove them through the night in the covered wagon to Invercargill, where Florence and her mother arrived in time to catch the morning train to Winton. There they hired horses and rode the rest of the way to Utapiri. During the trip, Florence was concerned about her mother, who had never been a strong person. The lack of comfort and sleep made her mother seem especially fragile. Ernest and Connie were relieved when the two travelers finally arrived. Horace was very ill. A doctor from Invercargill had made 2 visits and just pronounced that Horace must be moved into town, where he could be attended to every day. There was no road at Utapiri, and since Horace was too ill to mount a horse and ride, he had to be carried over the hills on a stretcher. It was the longest 13 miles Florence had ever walked. The weather turned cold on the first night, and they stopped at the home of a neighboring farmer. Snow fell heavily that night, and they were totally snowed in. It was 3 days before they were able to get on their way again. When they arrived at Invercargill, the family rented rooms in a boarding house. Horace's room was the only room with a fireplace in it, and everyone huddled together around the fire for fear that they too might catch pneumonia from the cold. Florence's mother did come down with illness. Mr. Young arrived from Ermaydale with Emily's 2 children to visit just before the doctor pronounced his diagnosis. It was just after 8 o'clock in the evening when the doctor left the boarding house. After he had gone, Mr. Young took Florence aside. "The doctor has spoken privately with me," he said. "He says your mother does not have the strength to fight the disease and probably won't live till morning." Florence stared at her father. She heard the words he said, but she could not believe them. She and her mother had come to nurse Horace. If anyone was near death, it was he, not her mother. Mrs. Young had been ill many times before, and Florence was convinced that she could make a slow recovery as she always had. However, she did not. Florence's mother died 2 hours later. Florence stared into the lifeless face of her mother. She could hardly think about what had happened, much less what to do next. A quiet family funeral followed 3 days later. Horace did not attend, as he hovered between life and death himself. Following the funeral, Florence returned to nursing her brother. It was a lonely vigil without her mother at her side. 2 doctors confirmed that Horace was indeed dying, but this time the doctor's predictions proved incorrect. Horace began to make a slow recovery, and 6 weeks later he returned with the rest of the family to Ermaydale. Florence found that the house of Ermaydale was now filled with sad memories for her. It was difficult for her to imagine a bright and happy future without her mother around. She grew depressed and became even more so when Emily and John Deck arrived back in Invercargill. While in England, Emily had given birth to a 5th baby, a son whom they named Northcote. With her return, Florence knew it was time for her sister's family to be reunited. But she had grown to love her 2 little charges, and hoped to see them move back into town to be with their parents. Constance left Ermaydale at the same time to finish her education in England, and Mr. Young moved to Invercargill to pursue a business scheme. With Horace and Ernest now back at Utapiri, only Florence and Arthur were left at Ermaydale. And when Arthur was away visiting the far reaches of the farm, Florence found herself alone at Ermaydale for up to 2 weeks at a time. For any 19-year-old girl, this would be a lonely existence, but for Florence, who was still trying to recover from the death of her mother, it was almost intolerable. When she learned that Emily, John, and their 5 children would be moving to Sydney, Australia, she could hardly bear to think about it. One thing, however, managed to turn Florence's attention from her own loneliness. Rabbits. Hundreds and thousands of them, perhaps even millions. Rabbits were not native to New Zealand. Early English settlers who thought it would be nice to go rabbit hunting had introduced them into the country. Regrettably, they did not realize that until too late that the rabbits had no natural enemies in New Zealand as they did in England. As a result, the rabbit population in New Zealand was soon wildly out of control. Rabbits grazed on the grass. The same grass was meant to feed cows and sheep. Often they came through like locusts, eating every blade of grass and causing erosion on the hillsides. Florence watched in frustration as her brothers tried everything they could think to rid the farms of the pests. They poisoned the rabbits, shot them, and made traps for them, but nothing seemed to have any impact on the rabbit population. Like many other homesteaders, Florence's father and brothers had no option in the end but to send their livestock away to be slaughtered and walk off the land. With all the grass gone, there was no point in staying at the farms. A family conference was held in Invercargill, and it was decided that both Emmerdale and Ottapiri should be sold, and Florence, her father, and her 3 brothers should all immigrate to Australia once again. Florence hoped it was the right move. She was tired of living in different countries, but she was cheered by the idea of being on the same continent as Emily and John and the children. In 1878, Florence moved to Invercargill while Arthur and Horace went ahead on a search for suitable investment in Australia. She eagerly awaited each letter her brothers wrote and followed their journey through New South Wales and Queensland. They had just been gone over a year when Arthur wrote to say that they had bought land near Bundaberg, about 200 miles north of Brisbane in Queensland. It was ideal land for growing sugarcane, which is a very profitable crop. Florence was relieved to know where she had finally going to settle in Australia. However, her father had some business to attend to in England, and so in early 1880, he and Florence and Ernest set out for England together. They traveled aboard the liner Deccan. On the way, the ship docked in Bombay, India for 7 days. Florence was excited about the stop. All her life, she had heard her father's stories about his childhood in India and his father's years as a judge. Now, finally, she got to explore her father's old haunts. They started by visiting the hill station of Mathuran, where Florence and Ernest borrowed horses and galloped around the trails. And they went to Carly Caves and the Borgons and to Kandala, to the spot where Mr. Young had shot his first tiger. By the time Florence reboarded the Deccan, she felt she understood her father's past a lot better. The ship sailed on and reached Plymouth, England, in May 1880. Constance was waiting at the dock for them. Florence was thrilled. It had been over 3 years since Florence had seen her younger sister, and the two of them had a lot of catching up to do. Florence was not sure how long they would be staying in England, so she made the most of every opportunity to sightsee and visit old friends. She accompanied her father to Edinburgh, where they ordered machinery for the sugar plantation. Then in the autumn, Ernest, Florence, and her father went on a tour of France and Italy. During the summer of 1881, both Florence and her father became ill with typhoid. After a week of raging fever, Florence began a slow recovery. Her father, though, became more ill and dehydrated and died of the disease on October 14th, 4 days after Florence turned 25 and he had turned 78. Florence was well enough to attend the funeral and watch as her father was laid to rest in Cookham churchyard. She could scarcely believe that now both her parents were gone, and she was thankful for the wonderful times she had had with her father on this trip. When the funeral was over, the 3 young siblings, still grieving their father's sudden death, discussed what to do next. Ernest felt it was time to go to Australia and help with the plantation. Constance was happy and secure in England among her extended family and decided to stay on there. Florence agonized over what she should do. She enjoyed England, but she could not imagine spending the rest of her life there. She was far too much of a colonial girl for that. But the idea of living on a sugar plantation did not appeal to her either. It was a man's world, and she knew that she would be lonely on the plantation. There was only one other option. Perhaps she could live in Sydney with Emily and John. There are 8 children in the family now, and Florence was almost certain that Emily would welcome her help. Florence and Ernest left England in the early December 1881. Florence hoped that she would find a permanent home with her older sister. She had no idea of the adventures that awaited her in Australia. Thank you.